Hey, bud. How you doing today?
You don't mind me eating in front of you, do you?
No, what are you eating?
Do you mind me eating in front of you?
No, I don't, but what are you eating?
Dried mango.
Oh, cool. You
It's
like
very
it?
healthy. It's
You,
very healthy.
yeah, do you have a dryer that you use?
No, I get it from Costco.
Okay. Well, it was interesting in our last interview that we did about Bernie Sanders. You said that interpreting conservatism in Burkean terms meant that we can't disattach concepts like this from the specific political contexts. And it reminded me of what you said in one of the last episodes of the Robin and Boom show, which is that there's no such thing as rationality as such, but there's examples of rationality. And this is actually a postmodern insight. Could you elaborate a
Well,
little bit about this?
yes. Let me finish chewing. So I think what I said, or maybe it was what Professor Carey said, that tradition is the home of rationality, like um, like language is the context of thought. So language gives form and structure to our thoughts in much the same way that tradition creates a context for rational thinking. So just as there is no such thing as language as such, there's the French language or the German language or the Italian language. Similarly, there's no such thing as rationality as such. There's rationalities that are embedded in our communities. There's the rationality of Orthodox Christianity, of Rabbinic Judaism, of Islamic jurisprudence, of Thomistic Catholicism. Now, people think this sounds like relativism, but it's not, because you can adjudicate between competing rationalities, but the adjudication doesn't come from a place of neutrality. You can, within your own tradition of rationality, you can be critical, you can be self-critical, you can compare it to other traditions, other traditions can dialogue with each other, and you can find that maybe one tradition is wrong in one area. So maybe the Japanese can learn something from us in America about human rights, and maybe we can learn something from their tradition about respecting elders. So we're not saying that all traditions are equal, or certainly not positing any type of moral relativism or epistemological relativism. We're just saying that traditions are the home of rationality in much the same way that language is the home and context of thought.
And
Um,
epistemology, that's our theory of knowledge. And many times people will have, if they don't have an overt philosophy, they'll have an implicit theology from which they look at the world. I've just finished listening to Father Thomas Hopko's speech he gave called The Abolition of Man, where he talks about how we're really in uncharted waters here with the postmodernism. And that's also something that was really intriguing for me about how the the place where all previous human cultures have located, that's why C.S. Lewis talked men without chests, because the place inside us where all cultures have before believed that you could evaluate right from wrong and make moral claims. Now people don't believe that that exists. We're only just brains and bodies. And in this type of postmodernism, we're seeing it give way to new horrors that previous generations couldn't even imagine. It's interesting to me how you talk about the modernism giving way to postmodernism, and how in modernism there became this idea that tradition is bad, and but they smuggled in their own traditions, and the tradition became that tradition is bad. Whereas in postmodernism, they say nothing ever matters. If you want to go do that, fine, but don't tell me.
Yes. Well, the postmodern insight, um, if you will, happens when modernism becomes self-critical and realizes that it too is a tradition. So modernism was very good at debunking all traditions, and um, associating tradition with irrationality. Excuse me, with irrationality. But then, when modernism realizes that it itself is a tradition, that then leads to postmodernism. That's what Philip Carey called the postmodern insight.
And can you touch on what C.S. Lewis meant when he talked about men without chests, and why he warned about the abolition of man if this kind of subjectivism becomes part of what people grow up and they believe?
Um, yes, well, it's been a while since I've read The Abolition of Man, but the idea of men without chests goes back to the tripartite psychology in Plato's middle period. He has, let me see if I can bring up some of my notes about this.
Is this when the Republic was written?
Most likely, most
Okay.
likely.
You were telling me the other day that they actually found a Gnostic version of Plato's Republic.
Yes, in the Nag Hammadi library, the um, the library where the Gnostic texts um, were unearthed, books like the Gospel of Thomas and other um, Gnostic so-called Gospels. They found a altered version of Plato's Republic, where Plato's works were changed to fit with Gnostic philosophy in much the same way that the Gospels were. And Plato was influential in Gnosticism. There's no doubt about that.
But it
But
wasn't Plato also very influential in the way the church fathers explained the incarnation? They used Platonic philosophy to explain how Christ could be God and man at the same time. Think about it, if they came today, if Jesus came today to earth, the church fathers wouldn't have any kind of philosophy, because how could they explain the incarnation in terms of the philosophy of today? Ontology is just a recapitulation of philology, but they were able to use the philosophy of Plato to explain many truths about the Trinity and the incarnation. So isn't it fair to say that also Plato was very influential in early Christian thought?
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I've been reading some works from the Blessed Augustine, who was very influenced by Plato and Neoplatonism in his Christian theology.
Mm-hmm.
There was no doubt that the in the providence of God, Greek philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, as well as Platonic philosophy, um, and as well as Epicureanism and Stoicism, the various types of Greco-Roman philosophies helped to pave the way for the gospel.
But going back to the idea of the men without chests, um, I think what C.S. Lewis meant was that in our idea that our views of life are just ultimately subjective and don't have any meaning, and this was taught in a grammar book, and now it's become part of the culture. We've lost that, at least philosophically, those that believe it, they've lost that part that makes us human. So do you think that's what he meant by the men without chests?
Um, yeah, so I'm just looking at my notes about Plato because that is definitely what he meant, but he's to nuance it a little more, he's drawing on Plato's tripartite psychology, which was developed in Plato's early life. He has a kind of simple dualism in some of the dialogues in the last days of Socrates. There's the immaterial soul and the material body. But then, as Plato's philosophy becomes more complex, quite possibly under the influence of Aristotle,
Which was
although
his
that's,
student, and they were good friends, huh?
yes, for 20 years, Aristotle was Plato's student, and he also um, helped teach at the academy. And so there must have been some cross-pollination of ideas. So we can speculate that as Plato's philosophy sort of comes down to earth a little bit more as he develops, that this may have been the influence of his student Aristotle. And I've just got my notes here on the tripartite psychology. So he has the highest part of the soul is the intellect. That's the part of the soul where we perceive the eternal forms, and so forth. And then the middle part of the soul is associated with the chest. That's where we can choose to listen to reason in order to bring justice, virtue, and goodness, and so forth down to earth. And this is the emotional or spirited part of man. And then
And so just kind of stop you right there. Postmodernism got rid of this. Is this true?
um,
Because they don't believe that this even exists in the human being?
well, this was the part that C.S. Lewis was talking about when he says that men are without chests. He's saying that they do not have that that part of them that can mediate what the soul perceives through the intellect. So you have the intellect. This is Plato's psychology. You have the intellect, then you have the chest, and then you have the gut. And the gut is what drags us down to the earth, our passions and so forth. And the intellect is what draws us towards the heavenly forms. And so for Plato, the chest represented the part of us that could choose to listen to reason or choose to listen to our gut. It was it's like a spirited horse that can follow its noble instincts or its base or animalistic impulses. So I think that C.S. Lewis is drawing on that. It's been a while since I've read The Abolition of Man, but he's talking about a state of affairs. He's talking about moral relativism and the evacuation from man of that mediating part of us that can pull us towards noble things or take us down to the earth.
Okay, one more thing, and then I'll let you go because I know it's a little later for me where I am, but I did take a nap earlier. Gnosticism. You've written a book about Gnosticism, and
I've remembered something else about abolition of man. And he was dealing with the educational system where modernism was deconstructing objective values. So when we say that something is good or beautiful or that a waterfall is ennobling, so forth. This is just an expression of our own attitudes. If I say that
The
mountain is
waterfall is
glorious,
sublime.
yes, if I say that waterfall is sublime, what I really mean is, what I'm really describing is just something within my internal state. And so the chest, if you will, the rational part of us, has no objective values to turn towards, and we get lost in the subjectivism of our own interiority.
And then it's
That's
very easy for elites to step in and try to play God, which we see playing out. As I was reading your book about Gnosticism and this idea that there's this bifurcation between the mind and the body, I guess, but also between the material and the immaterial, it had a lot of implications. But the Robin and Boom show was fresh in my mind, where you're talking about how modernism wanted to get rid of all traditions, but they started their own tradition that all traditions are bad, which we see actually reflected in a lot of Christian communities in that kind of implicit theology. But as I was reading all the examples of where modernism, Gnosticism, where you can find it in even in church teachings and stuff, like when people don't believe in the resurrection of the body, it became clear to me that Gnosticism it's become a type of Christian tradition, and people read dehistoricized Jesus, and they just read the Gospels as isolated quotes from Jesus, and there's no context. Talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I call myself a recovering Gnostic because I used to read the Bible like that. I used to read the Bible as isolated proof texts that could be extracted for a particular situation to prove a particular theological point or to help me in a particular thing I might encounter in my day. Now, that's not to say that that is an illegitimate use of scripture, at least not with respect to the latter. That's a legitimate use, but what I was failing to understand is to see the Bible as a story. So Jesus comes in the middle of the story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Jesus, the great climactic events of the incarnation, crucifixion, and the resurrection, that happens in the middle of the story. That is a recapitulation of the first creation and it's and anticipation of the final new creation, or the culmination of new creation, when the new heavens and the new earth are finally complete. And so, I've been spending a lot of time in the Old Testament recently because I want to understand that story that gives context to the Christological texts. The whole story of Israel and exile and longing for the Messiah, and then Jesus comes on the scene, but it's not like the people expected. And yet, in another sense, it's everything it makes sense of everything that went before, but not in the way that we could have expected. It's a radical recapitulation of the Genesis creation, and what we find in Christ then is that begins the long process of new creation that we are promised will reach fruition in the new heavens and the new earth. So yes, we can use scripture as for proof text, but there's a lot more to it. It's a story. It's a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. when I became Orthodox, I started to see Christian history in a new way, and how contemporary church worship is also it's an outgrowth of the Jewish temple worship.
Yes, scholars who have studied early Christian liturgics have concluded that it's very Christian worship is very earthy, because we worship a God who took on flesh and blood, and so we use the elements of creation in worship, then offer them back to God. He sanctifies creation through our worship, so that what's true in worship then spills out throughout the entire cosmos.
Mm-hmm. One more question before I let you go, and something that I've wondered about. I hear people like refer to the teachings of Socrates, and then they say Socrates taught this, and seems like they should be giving the credit to Plato, because as I understood it from taking Philosophy 101 many years ago, really is no historical figure of Socrates. All that we know of this guy is just a creation of Plato's fiction, if you will. And what do you think?
That's not exactly right, Patrick. We have other documents besides Plato that attest to the figure of Socrates, Xenophon, Aristophanes. There's other writers, but what's in question is what he was like. How accurate is Plato's portrayal of Socrates? Did Socrates really have the dialogues like the Euthyphro, but maybe not the Republic? The Republic is almost certainly all Plato, but where does Plato leave off and Socrates start up? Plato
Do you
presents
think
us with
Plato
a
was
very,
just so brilliant? Plato was just so brilliant. He wanted to accredit some of his ideas to somebody else in a humble way, to be modest.
it could be that was typical in the ancient world. Um, I think that could have been the case. Um, he genuinely respected Socrates and wanted to give credit to his teacher. But but you see, when we read other writers talking about Socrates, the other writers give a very unflattering picture of Socrates, a kind of very pompous
Almost
person who,
comedic, like a fool for Christ or something.
um, yes, kind of like that, but very stuck up and pompous, and some of that comes across in some of the apophatic dialogues. Socrates certainly enjoyed going and finding people who thought they were wise, and then using
Cutting
questions
them
to
down
poke
to
holes in.
stone.
Was that?
Cutting them down.
Yes.
Cutting them down to size. Hey,
Yes.
Robin, you're wrapping up a book on the good life. Just tell us in a
Oh,
nutshell.
can I just, before we leave the subject of Gnosticism, can I make an important announcement?
Yeah, sure.
This has not been announced yet, so I'm happy to do it on your program. But 2 days
I'm
ago,
deeply honored.
2 days ago, I got an email from my publisher, the one that's doing the book on the good life, and they want to publish a book on Gnosticism.
Oh, wow.
They've
That's
given me
great.
a year to complete it.
What is the good life?
Okay, yes. Well, so are you glad that they're publishing my book on Gnosticism?
Yeah, I'm overjoyed. I'm almost finished with it, by the way, and I got my notes all in my apartment. So I want to get you
Oh, okay. Well,
on for a more in-depth interview about the Gnosticism. I'm really enjoying it.
that manuscript that I sent you is just half the book. Now I have a year to finish writing it.
Okay, we'll talk.
So
Give us the good life in a nutshell, and then I'll let you get to bed.
the good life is Jesus Christ. The good life is living for Him. Our life on earth is just a blink of the eye compared to all of eternity. And um, this might sound strange coming from me with the work I've done on Gnosticism and the goodness of creation, but most of the time we run after transitory things that are of no use to us eternally. And the good life is taking a step back and asking, what are the things that are going to last forever? What do I want to what am I going to be able to take with me? And when you have that perspective, whatever you do in life becomes transformed because you do it for Jesus Christ. And yeah, that's the good life. Everything
Okay,
you do for the glory of God.
can you send me a PDF file on what you got? I will read it with enthusiasm.
Are you asking for a bootleg copy of my new book? Well, I have yes, I will send you a chapter. I will send you a chapter. We can do that on another program.
Okay, great, Robin. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Patrick. God bless you.